Hi, welcome back. This is the fifth week, and believe it or not, we are going to be halfway through after this week. As I've told you many times, what I'm going to do today is recap last week. And because last week was kind of a culmination of time value of money and criteria, which I think of kind of together. And we are going to move over to a different area, which is kind of a step into risk, if you may, without explicitly starting on risk. I would like to recap the important principles we learned towards the end of last week. Those are extremely important, especially because, though not about accounting, they are fundamental to any assessment you do. So I'm going to do a recap again of the principles we did. Okay, so the important principles of cash flow estimation. The first principle, if you remember, was that all cash flows of a project or a new idea or an existing idea's expansion have to be incremental. By that I mean the following. You have to, and just to give you a sense of what does it mean on a timeline, please try and do two analyses. I believe we had a 10-year horizon for a project, so this will be without project. Because life goes on, and it's called status quo or whatever, so don't assume that nothing is happening, unless, of course, this is a brand new project and idea. Even then, it's good to think about the world without the idea, and then with the idea. This is with project. And the value creation is the difference between this and this. So if this was A1 through A10, this is B1 through B10, it's the change that is value creating. I think I've written this a little bit fast because you've already seen it. So I would recommend very strongly to you to do two analyses every time till you get so used to doing the differences in your head. Okay, research shows that people who are early on in their profession cannot easily think changes in their head. They have to do it in a deliberate way till it becomes part of you. And then about 10 years down, after experience with doing analysis and thinking about ideas, you do it almost in your head. And the advantages of doing it explicitly is that you cannot make mistakes, or your mistakes become few. You don't double count, you don't forget opportunity cost, you don't forget sunk costs, and so on. And you don't forget thinking about what the world would look like without the project. I think that's extremely important. So what I'm going to do next is go on to the next principle, which is do not forget the importance of time zero. We talked a lot about it, and we didn't spend that much time on the last year of the chosen timeline, and I'll talk about it in a second later. But in the beginning at time zero, why is it important? Because at time zero some things happen which are different from time one and so on, and those things are called capital. You need capital. And the difference between capital and a cash flow, C1 and so on, is that one is a stock that's used throughout the process of the project, right? So what are the two kinds of capital? The two kinds of capital is, one is CapEx, which is buying machines and so on, and the other is working capital. And both come from where? Balance sheet. That's where assets reside. And so whenever you're thinking of capital, always think changes. It's not the level, because it's a snapshot, the balance sheet. Okay, we talked about this last time. What I'm going to do now is move on to the next principle, which is accounting issues are extremely important. And the reason why I'm going to emphasize this is to remind you that this class is not about accounting, but accounting is a language you need to be very aware of. And just some examples that we talked about, which are important ones, is the notion of, just let me write a couple of things down for you. So the notion of depreciation is important because it's an entirely fictitious creation. Trying to replicate something that's important in life, how much of the machine you use, but it's fictitious, so it's an accounting measure. Similarly, when you sell equipment at the end of a business and make a gain on selling the equipment, there are some tax implications which are accounting based. Finally, working capital, which we talked about, has to be thought of carefully. Why? Because you have to have account receivables, account payables, inventory, you have to think about all those issues, and understanding how accounting works is important. Fundamentally, what you want to do is you want to take accounting statements, which is the language of business, but which is kind of limited, as I said, languages are. You want to convert it into real stuff, cash flows or real value every year, and that requires some knowledge of what your language is to be able to convert it into reality, right? So that's the one issue that I really emphasize. And going back to it for one more time, please, when you have the time, try to acquire knowledge of accounting. It will be extremely helpful to you. The next principle is that whenever you're doing analysis of real assets, remember this is what generates the C's. Don't touch this, or as MC Hammer said, can't touch this. And the reason is financing is inherently included in the cost of capital, R. And by the way, starting today, after we have done the review, guess where we are going? We are going to financing. And the reason we are going to the financing is because we want to figure this out. But financing shouldn't be the primary determinant of the value of your assets, because the assets are what create value. So for example, imagine if you went to buy an iPad versus Samsung's version of a notebook. Would you ever wonder whether Samsung has debt versus Apple? Or do you just look at the product? I've never seen anybody ask, By the way, if iPad is produced entirely with debt, I'm not going to touch it, even though it's the coolest thing under the sun. It's a silly thing, right? So financing is not the first thing that pops to your mind when you think of value. You think of the product that you're going to buy or the service. So that's extremely important. The second thing, as I said, is financing is inherently included in the cost of capital, which is R. And by the way, I use lingo of finance, but hopefully you're now familiar with things like cost of capital, interest rate, saying the same kind of thing, right? So R, little r, and cost of capital are the same thing. Moving on, notice I'm going a little slow. And the reason is these are really important things, the whys of valuation, if you may, and the important things to remember. What does inflation have to do with things? So remember, you're doing C1, C10, right? But you're standing here. What will happen to the prices of all your revenue items, costs of goods sold and everything? They're going to change. So P1 will be different than P10. And for each item, so for your commodity you're trying to sell, there'll be inflation at different rate and so on and so forth. You got to include it. So you'll have quantities, Q1 times P1, either figuring out revenues or cost of goods sold. Don't forget that these should be changing. And it's pretty easy to get data on how different prices have behaved in the past and include them. And the reason is quite simple. When we go to R, it has inflation built in. Inflation is included in R. And the notion is very simple. If the interest rate is not going to compensate you for inflation, then what the heck is this doing? You know, I mean, that's the general intuitive idea of why inflation is always in the interest rate, right? So please keep that in mind. That's important. And notice we are almost done. But the last one is probably something that's of great practical importance. Remember, I gave you an idea of two projects, A and B, and they look like this. Minus 20 million, minus 2 million, 1, 2. This is the first kind of machine you could buy. And taxes have been taken into account, depreciation, everything, don't worry. Let's just stick with these are the costs involved. Or you could buy this machine. And I think I got the numbers right. And in year 3, negative 1 million. The first thing that jumps out at you is the following. That these are not equally lived or equal length machines. But one doesn't think of that, right? So typically what happens is you tend to compare the cost directly and pick the lower cost one. In this case, it's a little bit complicated because you have to include these costs too, right? And why is this 1 million versus 2 million? Because maintenance is lower for a more expensive machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over and show you the PVs of the two. Okay, so let's do this. I have already done it. So if you stare at the first row, you have minus 20, minus 2, minus 2, minus 25, minus 1, minus 1, minus 1 is in row 2. So what is 23.72? If you notice, and now you are cool, you can do all this stuff, you have done a lot of practice, so I'm not going to go through the steps. You notice that the PV of the first machine is 23.72, PV of the second machine is 27.72. And remember, these are costs. So how do you, if you're doing a cost-only analysis, how do you create value? By choosing the lower cost, right? And remember, these days, with the economy being what it has been at the US for a long time, cost minimization is a primary way of value creation, and don't underestimate its power. We all love great ideas, but they come very seldom. And the one thing I have against the way we teach, especially at business schools, is we sell something as, oh, positive NPV ideas are just floating around for you to just go pluck off thin air. No, it takes a lot of effort to create value. And the reason is you've got to be better than the competitor, right? It's very tough. Anyway, so the cost is higher for which machine? The more expensive one, right? Which is largely because of the 5 million today. So now the question is, which machine would you choose? People choose the first machine. What is the problem with that choice? Right away you recognize the problem is that the least low cost machines tend to last for a shorter interval. That's kind of built in, not always, but built into why it's lower cost, and we forget about that. So what do you want to do? You want to compare the two. One way to do it is to make the horizon 6 years. Then you will replace the first machine once and the second machine, first machine twice and the second machine once, right? Now that's a long way of doing it, right? Basically you're making a horizon. Finance is so awesome, you just need to convert these two numbers into per year, but keeping accounting in, keeping time value of money in mind. So let's do it. Let's convert this to an annuity. How would you do it? You'll do PMT, remember? PMT is already per year, and what's the nature of the beast? It's a fixed number. So what is the number I give into PMT? The first number I give is 0.05, which is the interest rate I've used for doing this. Next, second number is number of periods, right? How many? 2. The third number, which by the way I sometimes forget, is PV versus FV. Here it's PV, and which cell is PV in? I believe it's in A4. And if I got this right, it says error for some reason. Let's figure out what it is. It's 0.05, 2, and
that's a period.
That's period. Okay. Ryan here caught me, and you know look at my fingers. They go all over the place. Okay. 12.76. That means what? The 12.76 adjusted for time value of money is the per year cost. Look at the power of that little concept. It takes care of time value of money and everything. What is the second one? Let's do it slowly so that you understand what I was talking about. Is 0.05, 3, and where is the amount sitting in? A5. What do you notice? Actually, which machine will you buy? It's very obvious which one. You're not going to buy the cheap machine, because on a per year time value adjusted basis, it's $2 million more, right? So you see how dramatic finance is. It forces you to look forward and adjust for time, and most of us forget this. By the way, I forget it many times. I get attracted by ideas that cost less, right? So when I used to buy jeans, I used to buy jeans the cheapest possible. By the way, I love blue jeans. You know, it's one of the best inventions ever. So when you go buy jeans, you buy jeans cheap. Then I realized every 6 months I was having to replace them because it was not good. You know, they were falling apart. Then I started buying expensive jeans. And the good news is they are expensive, many times twice, but they last forever. I can't get rid of them. So just keep that in mind. Whenever something is cheap, think about whether its life is shorter or not. So let's take a pause here. We've covered all the issues. I'm going to cover one big idea about this stuff before going into the next, because it's a good transition. But we'll get to that in a second and take a break, think about the issues, and we'll get started in a minute.